I don't need love. I need an heir. The auction hall fell into a hush so sudden it felt like the air itself had been pulled out of the room. Crystal chandeliers glowing softly above rows of perfectly dressed strangers who had come to bid on art, on land, on influence. But not this, never this. Lily Harper stood near the back, her fingers curled tightly around the strap of her worn leather bag, the kind you buy once and carry until the seams begin to whisper their exhaustion. Her coat too thin for the marble-cold air, her breath steady only because she forced it to be, one slow inhale at a time, like she had learned in hospital waiting rooms where seconds stretched into hours and hope came in fragile doses. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in a place where heels clicked like confidence and laughter floated effortlessly over glasses of champagne, not in a room where every person seemed to belong to a world that had never once made space for someone like her. But she had stepped forward anyway, signed her name anyway, because somewhere across the city, in a small hospital bed surrounded by machines that hummed like distant thunder, a little boy was waiting for her to come back with something. Anything that could change what the doctors had already begun to say in softer and softer voices. Lot 17. The auctioneer called, his voice smooth, practiced, detached, as if this were no different from selling a painting or a sculpture, as if the weight of it didn't press into the bones of the person standing under the lights. And Lily felt every eye shift, felt the quiet judgment, the curiosity, the disbelief, but she didn't look down, didn't flinch, because dignity was the one thing she had left that no bill collector had managed to take from her. Then, from the front row, a man raised his hand. No hesitation, no glance around, just a single, controlled movement. Ethan Cole. The name moved through the room in whispers, carried like a current, billionaire, strategist, the kind of man who built empires with decisions that never trembled. And when his dark eyes lifted, they didn't scan the crowd, didn't acknowledge the spectacle. They landed directly on her, steady, unreadable, as if he had already calculated the outcome before anyone else had realized there was even a choice to be made. 10 million, he said, his voice low, almost quiet, yet it cut through the room with absolute certainty, and a ripple of shock followed, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of reaction people tried to hide behind polite expressions but couldn't fully contain. Lily's heart stuttered, not from the number, not from the man, but from what it meant, from the reality that this was no longer an abstract decision, no longer a desperate thought whispered in the dark at 3 a.m. This was real, unfolding, irreversible. She should have felt fear. She should have stepped back. She should have walked out and let the doors close behind her. But instead, she lifted her chin just slightly, her grip tightening, because somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and the quiet desperation, there was a single, unwavering truth anchoring her in place. She hadn't come here to be saved. She had come here to save someone else. And as the gavel hovered in the air, suspended in that fragile moment before everything changed, Ethan Cole didn't look at the auctioneer, didn't look at the crowd. He looked at her, and for the briefest second, something almost human flickered beneath the surface of his control, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by the calm certainty of a man who never made mistakes, and the sound that followed. The sharp, final strike of wood against wood, echoed louder than it should have, sealing. A decision that would bind two completely different worlds together in ways neither of them fully understood yet. The room emptied slower than it should have, as if no one quite knew how to exit a moment they did not understand. But Lily did not move, not yet, her feet rooted to the polished floor while the echo of the gavel still lingered in her chest, steady and heavy. And when she finally stepped forward, guided by a quiet assistant in a tailored suit, the world seemed to narrow into something smaller, quieter, more precise. Like every step she took was crossing an invisible line she could never uncross. And at the end of it, near a private corridor, lined with soft lighting and muted paintings, Ethan Cole was waiting. Up close, he was even more composed than he had seemed from across the room, his posture effortless, his expression unreadable, the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice to be heard because everything about him already commanded attention. And yet there was no arrogance in the way he looked at her, only a kind of careful observation, as if he were studying a variable he had not fully accounted for. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice calm, measured, "you understand this is not a game." Lily let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her fingers tightening briefly before she forced them to relax. Because fear had a way of making people small, and she refused to shrink now, not after everything that had brought her here. I understand exactly what this is, she replied, her voice steady, though her heart beat hard enough to remind her of every risk she was taking. And for a moment, something shifted in his gaze, subtle but real, as if he had expected hesitation, uncertainty, something easier to control. He nodded once, then gestured toward a door that led into a private office, the space inside quiet and immaculate, glass walls overlooking the city lights stretching for miles, a view that spoke of power in a language she had never been taught but could still recognize. On the table between them lay a folder, thick, structured, deliberate, and when he opened it, the sound alone felt final. "This is a contract," he said, sliding it toward her. "Clear terms, no ambiguity, no assumptions." Lily did not reach for it immediately, her eyes lingering on the edge of the paper as if the weight of it could be measured without touching it. And then, slowly, she sat down, the chair softer than anything she had sat in for months, though comfort felt out of place here. "You want a child," she said quietly, not as a question but as a recognition, and Ethan did not deny it. "I want an heir," he corrected, his tone even, "someone to carry forward what I built. No complications, no emotional entanglements, just an agreement." The words were clean, almost clinical, but something about the way he said them suggested they had been repeated before, rehearsed until they lost any trace of vulnerability. Lily finally lifted the contract, her eyes scanning lines of legal language that turned human lives into structured expectations, timelines, obligations, and as she read, one detail pressed harder than the rest, louder than everything else, and she looked up. "There is nothing here about my son," she said, her voice softer now, but not weaker, and for the first time, Ethan's expression paused, just slightly. "He is not part of this agreement," he replied, matter of fact, as if removing a variable from an equation. Lily swallowed, the image of a small hospital bed flashing through her mind, the quiet beeping of machines, the way tiny fingers had curled around hers earlier that day, and she placed the contract back on the table without signing. "Then we need to adjust the terms," she said, meeting his gaze fully now, "because I am not here to replace one child with another." The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, a shift in balance. And for the first time since the auction, Ethan Cole did not immediately respond, his eyes narrowing just enough to reveal something unexpected: interest. For a long second, neither of them moved, the city lights beyond the glass stretching endlessly like a world that had never known compromise. And yet inside that quiet office, everything had just shifted, subtle but undeniable, because Lily Harper had just done something no one in Ethan Cole's world ever did. She had pushed back. Ethan leaned slightly against the edge of the table, his fingers resting near the contract but not touching it, his gaze steady, analytical, as if recalculating variables in real time. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight, quieter, more deliberate. "You are negotiating terms," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Lily nodded once, her posture straight despite the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones over the past months, because this moment mattered more than comfort, more than fear, more than anything else. "I am setting boundaries," she replied, her tone firm, "because if I am agreeing to this, it does not mean I stop being a mother." The word lingered in the space between them, not dramatic, not forced, just true. And something about it made Ethan's expression tighten for a fraction of a second before smoothing again into control. "Your child," he said slowly, "is not part of what I am asking for." Lily inhaled, steady but heavy, the image of a small hospital room rising again in her mind, the faint smell of antiseptic, the quiet hum of machines, the way time seemed to stretch thinner with each passing day, and she stepped closer to the table, her hand resting lightly against the edge as if grounding herself. "He is the reason I am here," she said, her voice softer now but carrying more weight than anything she had said before. "So if you want an agreement with me, then you accept that I do not exist without him." Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was shifting, recalibrating, and Ethan's eyes did not leave hers, as if searching for hesitation, for weakness, for anything that might make this simpler. But there was none, only a quiet certainty that did not match the desperation he had expected. Finally, he exhaled once, controlled, measured, and reached for the contract, flipping through the pages with practiced ease before setting it down again. "You are asking to introduce an uncontrolled variable," he said, his tone returning to its precise, structured cadence. But there was something underneath now, something less rigid. Lily almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it revealed something about him, something that explained the way he approached everything as if it were a system that could be managed if only the right rules were applied. "No," she corrected gently. "I am asking you to accept reality." That landed differently, and for the first time, Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly to the city beyond the glass before returning to her. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "What does he need?" The question was simple, but it carried something new, something that had not been present before, and Lily felt her chest tighten, not from fear this time, but from the weight of finally being asked the one question that mattered. "Treatment," she said, the word barely above a whisper but steady. "Consistent care, time, and a chance." Ethan studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if a decision had been made somewhere deep beneath the surface. "Then we adjust the contract," he said, pulling a pen from the table and sliding it across to her. "But understand this, Miss Harper, once we do, there is no halfway." Lily looked at the pen, then back at him, her reflection faintly visible in the glass behind him, a woman standing between two worlds with no guarantee of what either would give her. And after a brief pause, she reached forward and took it, her fingers steady, because halfway had never been an option for her. The pen felt heavier than it should have, its polished surface cool against Lily's fingers as she held it just above the contract. The weight of the decision pressing into her chest not as panic, but as something steadier, something quieter, the kind of certainty that only comes when there are no other options left worth choosing. And for a brief moment, the world outside that glass office seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by the memory of a small hospital room where a boy with tired eyes still managed to smile every time she walked in, as if he believed she could fix everything simply because she was there. Ethan watched her closely, not impatient, not urging, but attentive in a way that suggested he understood the significance of hesitation, as if he recognized that this was not about the ink or the paper, but about what came after, about the life that would unfold once the signature was written and the rules became real. "Once you sign," he said quietly, breaking the silence without disrupting it, "your life will change completely. You will live under my protection, my schedule, my expectations. There will be no room for uncertainty." Lily let out a slow breath, her eyes still on the page, scanning the final lines again. The clauses that defined boundaries, timelines, obligations, each word precise, each sentence constructed to eliminate ambiguity, and yet none of it could fully capture what this meant to her, what it would cost, what it might give. "I am not afraid of change," she said, her voice calm but firm, and when she finally looked up, her eyes met his with a clarity that did not waver. "I am afraid of running out of time." That landed deeper than anything before, and for a fraction of a second, something in Ethan's expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to suggest that her words had reached a place he did not often allow people to touch. He gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging a truth he would not question, and stepped back just enough to give her space, a small gesture that felt larger than it should have. Lily lowered her gaze again, the pen moving now, deliberate, steady, her signature forming across the page in clean strokes that marked the end of one life and the beginning of something entirely unknown. And when she finished, she set the pen down gently, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the finality of what she had just done. Ethan stepped forward, his movements controlled as always, and turned the contract toward himself, his eyes scanning the signature for only a second before he added his own, his handwriting sharp and precise, mirroring the man himself. And when he closed the folder, the sound was soft but decisive, like the quiet click of a door that would not reopen. "It is done," he said, his voice even, but there was a new layer beneath it now, something less distant, more grounded, as if the agreement had shifted something in him as well. Lily nodded once, her hands resting lightly at her sides, the absence of the pen making them feel strangely empty. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not awkward but transitional, like the pause between two completely different chapters of a life. Then Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek black card, placing it on the table between them. "Your son's treatment will begin immediately," he said, his tone direct, efficient, but not cold. "A private medical team, full coverage, no delays." Lily's breath caught, just for a second, the words settling into her slowly. Carefully, because hope had become something she handled with caution, something she did not allow herself to fully feel too quickly, and yet there it was, undeniable, real. She nodded again, this time softer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Ethan studied her for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Do not thank me," he said, his gaze steady. "This is not charity. This is an agreement." But even as he said it, there was something in the way he looked at her that suggested it was already becoming more than that, something neither of them had planned for, something that had begun the moment she refused to be anything less than a mother. The car ride was silent, but not empty, the kind of silence that carried weight rather than discomfort. As the city unfolded outside the tinted windows in long stretches of glowing streets and passing headlights, each block taking Lily further away from the life she had known and deeper into something she still could not fully define, her hands resting in her lap, as if she were holding onto something invisible, something fragile. While across from her, Ethan Cole sat with the same composed stillness he seemed to carry everywhere, his posture relaxed but deliberate, as if even rest was a decision he made consciously. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been written into the contract now resting in his briefcase, sealed and binding, leaving only the quiet reality of what came next. When the car finally slowed, turning through tall iron gates that opened without hesitation, Lily found herself looking out at a long, curved driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and soft ground lights that guided the path like something out of a world she had only ever seen from a distance. And at the end of it stood a house that did not feel like a house at all, but something larger, quieter, almost untouchable in its stillness. The car came to a smooth stop, and before she could reach for the handle, the door opened from the outside, a staff member offering a polite nod, and Lily stepped out. Slowly, her shoes pressing into perfectly laid stone, the air cooler here, cleaner somehow, as if even the environment had been curated with the same precision as everything else in Ethan's life. "This will be your residence," Ethan said as he stepped out behind her, his voice even, not boastful, not apologetic, simply stating a fact, and Lily turned slightly, her eyes moving over the structure again, taking in its scale, its silence, the absence of anything out of place. "It does not feel real," she admitted quietly, and for a brief moment, Ethan's gaze shifted toward the house as well, as if seeing it through her perspective for the first time, before returning to her. "It is," he replied, and then after a short pause, he added, "You will adjust." Inside, the space was just as precise, open rooms filled with soft light, furniture arranged with intention, everything balanced in a way that felt almost too perfect, and as they walked through the entrance, Lily became aware of how quiet it was, not the comfortable quiet of a lived-in home, but something more controlled, more distant, as if sound itself had been filtered. A woman approached them, dressed in a tailored uniform, her expression warm but professional. "Miss Harper, welcome," she said gently. "I will be assisting you with your transition." Lily nodded, still taking everything in, her mind trying to reconcile the contrast between this place and the small apartment she had left behind just hours ago, where the walls had been thin and the nights had been filled with the distant sounds of neighbors and traffic and life. "Your belongings have already been transferred," the woman continued, gesturing toward a hallway, "and your room has been prepared." Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second at that, the word room feeling smaller than what this place seemed to offer, but she followed anyway, her steps quieter now against the polished floors, until they reached a door that opened into a space larger than her entire apartment had been, filled with soft textures and warm lighting that contrasted with the rest of the house, as if someone had tried to make this one area feel more human. If you need anything at all, please let us know, the woman said before stepping back, leaving Lily alone in the room for the first time since the contract had been signed. The door closed softly behind her, and for a moment, she did not move, her eyes scanning the space, the bed, the windows, the carefully placed details, until she finally walked forward and set her bag down on a small table, the worn leather suddenly out of place against everything around it. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering for just a second before she pressed the call button, and when the line connected, her voice softened instantly, the tension in her shoulders easing in a way nothing else had managed to do that night. "Hey, sweetheart," she said quietly, a small smile forming despite everything. "I am going to make sure you are okay, I promise." And somewhere down the hall, unseen, Ethan paused mid-step, his attention caught not by the words themselves, but by the way she said them, the certainty in her voice, the kind of promise he had never heard anyone make without hesitation. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of slow, filtered light that slipped through floor-to-ceiling windows and painted soft lines across the unfamiliar room. And for a moment, Lily did not move, her eyes half open as she tried to remember where she was, the silence around her too complete, too controlled, nothing like the distant hum of traffic and muffled voices she had grown used to. And then it came back to her all at once, not as panic, but as a steady awareness that everything had changed. Overnight, she sat up slowly, the bed beneath her too soft, too perfect, as if it had been designed for comfort she had never allowed herself to expect, and for a second, she simply looked around, grounding herself in the reality of it, the clean lines, the carefully placed details, the absence of anything chaotic or unpredictable. And then her gaze moved to her phone resting on the nightstand, and without hesitation, she reached for it. The call connected on the second ring, and her expression softened immediately, her voice lowering into something warmer, something entirely different from the composure she had held onto the night before. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said gently, a small smile forming as she listened, her eyes closing briefly at the sound on the other end, and whatever tension had remained in her shoulders eased just enough to remind her why she was here, why she had signed that contract without looking back. "Yes, I slept," she added softly, even though it had not been much. "And guess what? The doctors are going to take really good care of you today, better than ever." There was a pause as she listened again, her smile widening just slightly, and then she let out a quiet laugh, the sound light, genuine, filling the otherwise silent room in a way nothing else had yet. "I will come see you soon, I promise," she said, her tone steady, certain, and when the call ended, she held the phone in her hand for a second longer, as if holding on to the connection itself, before finally setting it down. A soft knock came at the door, gentle but precise, and before she could respond, it opened just enough for the same woman from the night before to step in, her presence calm and efficient. "Good morning, Miss Harper," she said with a polite nod. "Your schedule has been prepared." Lily blinked slightly at that, the word schedule landing differently now, more structured, more real, and she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cool floor as she stood. "Schedule," she repeated quietly, almost to herself, and the woman offered a small, reassuring smile. "Mr. Cole believes in clarity," she explained, handing Lily a sleek tablet, the screen already lit with a detailed list of times, appointments, fittings, consultations, each hour accounted for with precision that left no room for uncertainty. Lily scanned it briefly, her eyes moving over the entries, the pace of it all faster than anything she was used to, and yet there was something grounding about it, something that suggested control, direction, purpose. "And my son?" she asked, looking up, her voice calm but focused, and the woman nodded immediately. "His medical team began early this morning," she replied. "You will receive updates throughout the day, and a private visit has been arranged for you this afternoon." Relief did not come as a rush. It came as something quieter, something deeper, settling into Lily's chest like a steady breath she had been waiting to take, and she nodded once, her grip tightening slightly on the tablet, as if anchoring herself to this new reality. "Thank you," she said, and this time, The words carried less hesitation, less caution, because this part, at least, was working. Down the hall, Ethan stood near the large windows of his office, a cup of coffee untouched on the desk behind him, his attention drawn not to the city below, but to the faint sound of Lily's voice from earlier, echoing in his mind in a way he had not expected, the quiet certainty, the way she spoke without calculation, without strategy, and for reasons he could not immediately define. He found himself glancing at the schedule he had approved just hours ago, his eyes lingering on a single line. He had not originally intended to include the one that read, "Hospital visit, 3 p.m." And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole adjusted something not because it was efficient, but because it felt necessary. The afternoon light was brighter, sharper, cutting through the city in clean angles as the car moved steadily through traffic, and Lily sat quietly in the back seat, her hands folded loosely in her lap, the tablet from earlier resting beside her, its structured schedule now replaced by something far more personal, far more urgent, because for the first time since signing the contract, she was going somewhere that felt real, somewhere that connected her past and present in a way that no polished room or curated space ever could. She watched the buildings pass by, each block pulling her closer to the hospital, her chest tightening slightly with a familiar mix of anticipation and caution, because hope had taught her to move carefully, to never arrive too quickly. And yet today felt different, not because the situation had changed, but because the possibilities around it had. When the car slowed and turned into the hospital entrance, the contrast was immediate, the sterile brightness, the quiet urgency, the subtle tension that lived in every hallway, and Lily stepped out before the driver could open the door, her movements faster now, more instinctive, as if her body already knew where to go. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something softer beneath it, something human, and as she moved through the familiar corridors, the polished world she had left behind felt distant, almost irrelevant, replaced entirely by the sound of quiet footsteps, distant monitors, and the steady rhythm of people who carried responsibility in ways that did not need to be spoken aloud. "Miss Harper," a nurse greeted her with a warm, reassuring smile. "He has been asking for you." Lily nodded quickly, her breath catching just slightly, and she followed without hesitation, her pace quickening as they approached the room, her heart beating faster with each step until the door was right in front of her, and for a brief second, she paused, her hand hovering over the handle, grounding herself in the moment before stepping inside. The room was brighter than she remembered, sunlight filtering through the window in soft, gentle lines. And there he was, small against the hospital bed, but somehow still full of presence, his eyes lighting up the moment he saw her, a smile forming that made everything else fall away. "Mom," he said, his voice soft but clear, and Lily felt something in her chest loosen instantly, her own smile appearing without effort as she crossed the room and sat beside him, her hand reaching for his with a familiarity that needed no thought. "Hey you," she said gently, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, her touch light but steady. "You look stronger already." He laughed quietly, the sound small but real, and for a few minutes, the world narrowed to just that, simple conversation, small reassurances, the kind of connection that did not need anything more than presence to feel complete. What she did not notice at first was the figure standing just outside the door, still, silent, observing without interruption. Ethan had not planned to stay, had not intended to follow through beyond ensuring the arrangements were in place, but something had shifted when he saw her step into that room, something that made him pause instead of leave. He watched as Lily spoke, not performing, not adjusting, simply being exactly who she was, her voice softer, her movements unguarded, her focus entirely on the child in front of her, and for reasons he could not immediately define, it unsettled him, not in a negative way, but in a way that disrupted the structure he was used to, the predictability he relied on. When the boy reached for her hand and held it tightly, as if anchoring himself to her presence, Ethan's gaze lingered, his expression unreadable but no longer entirely detached, and in that quiet moment, standing just outside a door he had no reason to enter, Ethan Cole witnessed something he had never accounted for in any of his carefully constructed plans, something that could not be written into a contract or controlled by terms, something that felt unfamiliar and yet undeniably real. The moment stretched longer than it should have, quiet and fragile, as Lily sat beside the bed, her fingers gently tracing small circles on the back of the boy's hand while he talked about things that seemed simple but carried the weight of everything that mattered. The color of the sky he could see through the window, the nurse who brought him apple juice that morning, the promise she had made to come back. And each word settled into the room like something steady, something real, something that did not need to be complicated to be important. "Are you staying?" he asked suddenly, his voice softer now, his eyes searching hers with a kind of quiet hope that did not demand anything, but still asked everything. And Lily felt that familiar pull in her chest, the one that made every decision sharper, more immediate. "I am not going anywhere," she said gently, her thumb brushing over his knuckles, her voice steady in a way that left no room for doubt. And he nodded, accepting it without question, because to him, her words were enough. They always had been. Outside the door, Ethan shifted slightly, the movement subtle but deliberate, as if something inside him had unsettled his usual stillness, and he found himself looking away for a brief second, his gaze landing on the quiet hallway, on people passing by with purpose, before returning to the scene inside the room, drawn back despite himself. He had built his life on clarity, on decisions that removed uncertainty, on systems that ensured outcomes could be predicted and controlled, and yet what he was seeing now did not follow any of those rules. It did not fit into any structure he understood, and still, it held a kind of power he could not ignore. When the boy laughed again, a small, genuine sound that filled the space without effort, Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not from discomfort, but from something unfamiliar, something he had not anticipated feeling, and before he could analyze it further, Lily stood slowly, leaning down to press a soft kiss against the boy's forehead, her movements natural, unguarded, the kind of gesture that came from instinct rather than intention. "I will be back tomorrow," she said, her voice warm, certain, and the boy smiled, already trusting the promise as if it were something permanent, something guaranteed. As she turned toward the door, her expression shifted slightly, the softness still there but layered now with the awareness of everything waiting for her outside that room. The agreement, the expectations, the world she had stepped into just hours ago. And when she opened the door, she stopped for a fraction of a second, her eyes meeting Ethan's directly. There was no surprise in her expression, no confusion, just a quiet recognition, as if she had known, in some instinctive way, that he would be there. "You stayed," she said softly, not accusing, not questioning, simply acknowledging, and Ethan held her gaze for a moment before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I needed to see," he replied, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something less certain than before. Lily studied him briefly, her eyes searching his in a way that felt more direct than anything they had shared so far, and then she stepped fully into the hallway, closing the door gently behind her, leaving the room, and the version of herself inside it, momentarily separate from everything else. "He is doing better," she said after a short pause, her voice steady again, controlled, but not distant, and Ethan glanced once at the closed door before looking back at her. "I ensured that," he replied, his tone returning to its structured precision, but it did not sound the same as it had before. Something in it softened, even if only slightly. Lily noticed, but she did not comment on it, instead nodding once, as if accepting both the words and what lay beneath them. And as they began walking down the hallway together, their steps falling into an unspoken rhythm, the distance between them felt different now, not smaller, but no longer defined entirely by the contract they had signed, as if something unplanned had begun to exist alongside it, something neither of them had agreed to, and yet neither of them was turning away from. The walk out of the hospital felt different than the walk in, not lighter, not easier, but steadier, as if something had shifted into place without either of them fully acknowledging it. And as the glass doors slid open and the late afternoon air met them, Lily took a small breath, grounding herself again in the space between two worlds, one filled with machines and quiet hope, the other built on precision and control. And for the first time, she was standing with a foot in both. Ethan moved beside her without speaking, his pace measured, his attention seemingly forward, But there was a subtle awareness in the way he matched her steps, not leading, not following, simply aligning. And when the car door opened, he paused just briefly, allowing her to enter first. A gesture so small it could have been overlooked, yet it carried a kind of intention that had not been present before. Inside, the silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence from the night before. It no longer felt like distance, but something more observational, as if both of them were processing something they had not yet chosen to name. Lily glanced out the window at the passing streets, the city moving in a rhythm she had always known, but now seen through a slightly different lens, and after a moment, she spoke, her voice calm, thoughtful. "You did not have to come inside," she said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what was obvious. And Ethan's gaze shifted slightly toward her, his expression composed but less guarded than before. "No," he agreed quietly, "I did not." The answer hung there, incomplete, and Lily turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his with a quiet curiosity, as if waiting for something more, something that would explain why he had stood there, watching something that had nothing to do with contracts or outcomes. Ethan looked away briefly, his gaze settling on the passing skyline before returning to her, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a subtle change, something less calculated. "But I wanted to understand," he said, and for the first time, the words did not sound like strategy, they sounded like truth. Lily held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, accepting the answer without pressing further, because she understood that some things did not need to be explained fully to be real. The car slowed as it approached the estate, the gates opening with the same quiet precision as before, and as they stepped out, the familiar stillness of the place greeted them again, but it did not feel quite as distant now, not entirely untouched, as if something from the outside world had followed them in. "You handled today well," Ethan said as they walked toward the entrance, his tone neutral but carrying a hint of acknowledgement that went beyond simple observation, and Lily glanced at him briefly, a faint smile touching her lips. "I did not do anything special," she replied softly. "I was just with him." Ethan stopped walking for a fraction of a second, the words settling into something deeper than they should have, and then continued forward. But his expression had shifted, the precision still there, but now layered with something quieter, something reflective. Later that evening, as the house settled into its usual silence, Lily found herself standing near one of the large windows, her phone in her hand, reading a message update from the medical team, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she absorbed the details. And across the hall, Ethan stood in his office, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass, his attention not on the numbers or reports in front of him, but on a single thought that had begun to take shape, something he could not easily categorize or dismiss. For years, he had believed that everything of value could be built, controlled, secured through the right decisions, the right structures. But what he had seen today did not follow those rules. It existed outside of them, and yet it held a kind of certainty he had never been able to replicate. He glanced down at the contract resting on his desk, its terms clear, its purpose defined, and for the first time since it had been signed, he did not see it as complete, not entirely, because something had entered the equation that had not been accounted for, something that could not be measured or predicted. And as he looked back out at the city, Ethan Cole realized, quietly, that for the first time in a long time, he was no longer entirely in control. The next morning did not begin with silence. It began with a message that should not have existed. And when Ethan stepped into his office, already dressed, already composed, his assistant was waiting, her posture professional, but her expression carrying a trace of hesitation that immediately drew his attention, because hesitation was not something he allowed in his environment. "Mr. Cole," she said carefully, handing him a thin folder, "there is something you should review." Ethan took it without a word, his movements precise as always, but the moment he opened it, something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, his eyes scanning the contents once, then again, slower this time, as if confirming what he was seeing rather than simply reading it. Across the house, unaware of what was unfolding, Lily stood near the window in her room, her phone pressed gently to her ear, her voice soft, steady, grounding, as she spoke to the nurse on the other end, listening carefully, asking questions not as someone unfamiliar with uncertainty, but as someone who had lived inside it long enough to know which details mattered most. So his response is improving, she said quietly, her fingers resting lightly against the glass, watching the morning light stretch across the gardens below. And when the answer came, she closed her eyes briefly, letting the relief settle in small, controlled waves, because she had learned not to let hope rush too quickly, not to trust it fully until it proved itself over time. "Thank you," she added softly, before ending the call, her shoulders easing just slightly as she placed the phone down, unaware that just down the hall, something had already begun to unravel. Ethan closed the folder slowly, the sound controlled but final, his gaze lifting to meet his assistant's. "Who authorized this?" he asked, his voice calm, but carrying a sharp edge beneath it, the kind that did not need volume to be understood. "It was processed years ago," she replied, her tone careful. "The records were sealed under private adoption protocols." The word landed heavier than anything else, not because it was unfamiliar, but because of what it meant. And for a moment, Ethan said nothing, his mind moving quickly, connecting details he had not questioned before, filling gaps he had not thought to examine, until the conclusion formed clearly, undeniably. "The child," he said slowly, his voice quieter now, more focused, "is not biologically hers." It was not a question, and the assistant did not respond as if it were, only giving a small nod, confirming what he already understood. The room fell silent, but this silence was different from the others. It was sharper, more charged, not with confusion, but with something closer to realization. And for the first time since the contract had been signed, Ethan felt something unexpected move through him, not anger exactly, but something close to it, something that came from the disruption of certainty, from the idea that a key element of the agreement had not been what he believed it to be. Across the hall, Lily moved toward the door, unaware of the shift that had just occurred, her mind still anchored in the update she had received, in the small improvements that meant everything. And as she stepped into the corridor, she paused, sensing something in the air, something subtle but different, and when she turned, she found Ethan already standing there, the folder still in his hand, his expression composed but no longer neutral. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the space between them holding something new, something heavier. And when Ethan finally stepped forward, his voice was calm, but it carried a weight that had not been there before. "We need to talk," he said, and Lily felt a quiet tension settle in her chest. Not fear, not yet, but the instinctive understanding that something had changed, something she had not prepared for. And as she nodded slowly, meeting his gaze without stepping back, the fragile balance they had begun to build shifted, not breaking, but no longer steady, as the truth he had just uncovered began to move between them, waiting to be spoken aloud. The door closed softly behind them, sealing the room in a quiet that felt heavier than any silence they had shared before, and Lily stood still for a moment, her eyes fixed on Ethan as he placed the folder on the table between them, his movements controlled, deliberate. But there was something beneath that control now, something sharper, something that had not been there before. "You should explain this," he said, his voice calm, but the calm carried weight, the kind that did not invite avoidance. And Lily's gaze dropped briefly to the folder before returning to him, her expression steady, though her chest tightened slightly as she understood what this was about without needing to open it. "You looked into my past," she said quietly, not accusing, not surprised, simply stating a fact, and Ethan did not deny it. "I verify what I invest in," he replied, his tone precise, but there was a shift in it now, something more personal than professional, and this was not disclosed. The word disclosed lingered in the air, sharp and clinical, and Lily inhaled slowly, grounding herself before responding, because this was not a conversation she could navigate with fear. "You did not ask," she said, her voice even, her gaze unwavering, and for a brief second, something in Ethan's expression tightened, not because she was wrong, but because she was right in a way he had not accounted for. "It changes the nature of the agreement," he said, stepping closer now. Not aggressive, but more direct, as if closing the distance would clarify something that still felt out of place. "You presented yourself as a single mother, and yet the child is not biologically yours." Lily held his gaze, the words landing but not shaking her, Because this was a truth she had lived with long before he had discovered it. A truth that had shaped her choices, her sacrifices, her understanding of what it meant to stay when leaving would have been easier. "He is my son," she said quietly, the simplicity of the statement carrying more weight than any explanation could have, and Ethan exhaled once, controlled, but the tension did not leave his posture. "That is not what I am questioning," he replied, his voice lower now, more focused. "I am questioning why you withheld information that is directly relevant to an agreement built on clarity." Lily stepped forward then, closing the space between them not to confront, but to be fully seen, her eyes steady, her voice calm, but no longer distant. "Because it should not matter," she said, and for the first time, there was something in her tone that carried a quiet challenge, not defensive, but firm. "You wanted a child, not a genetic blueprint, and I came here for one reason, to make sure he has a future." The words settled into the room, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, and Ethan's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward, as if something in what she said disrupted the framework he had been holding on to. "You made a decision without informing me," he said after a moment, but the edge in his voice had softened, just enough to suggest that this was no longer only about the contract. "I made a decision to stay," Lily replied, her voice quieter now, but carrying more weight than before, "when someone else walked away." That landed differently, deeper, and for a second, the room felt still in a way that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with what had just been revealed beneath the surface of her words. Ethan studied her, really studied her now, not as a variable, not as part of an agreement, but as a person whose choices did not fit into the patterns he was used to, and for the first time since he had opened that folder, something shifted in his understanding, not fully, not completely, but enough to unsettle the certainty he had built his life around. Lily did not look away, did not step back, her presence steady, grounded, and as the tension between them settled into something quieter, something more complex, it became clear that this was no longer just about what had been hidden, but about what he had never considered to be possible. And for the first time since he had asked her to sign that contract, Ethan Cole was no longer certain he understood the terms of the agreement at all. The silence did not break immediately. It shifted, softened at the edges as something deeper than argument settled between them, and Lily took a slow breath, her shoulders lowering just slightly as if she had finally said something she had carried for too long. While Ethan stood still, his gaze fixed on her, not searching for flaws now, not dissecting her words, but absorbing them in a way he was not used to, because for the first time, this was not about control, it was about understanding. Something he had never needed to understand before. "You chose him," he said quietly after a moment, not as an accusation, not even as a question, but as a realization forming in real time, and Lily nodded once, her expression calm, grounded, the truth of it no longer something she needed to defend. "Yes," she replied simply, and the weight of that word carried more meaning than anything else she could have added. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting for a brief second before returning to her, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, the sharp edge gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to reflection. "Most people choose what is easier," he said, almost to himself, and Lily's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not because it was amusing, but because it was familiar. "He was not easy," she said softly, "but he was mine." The words settled into the space between them, not dramatic, not forceful, just steady and undeniable, and for a moment, Ethan said nothing, his mind moving through something he had never needed to question before. Something that did not align with the way he had built his life, where everything had been calculated, measured, optimized for outcome. And yet here stood someone whose most defining decision had not followed any of those rules, and still, it had created something real, something lasting. He turned slightly, his hand resting on the back of the chair as if grounding himself, and then, without looking at her, he reached for the contract still lying on the table, the same document that had once felt complete, precise, controlled, and he picked it up slowly, his eyes scanning it not for accuracy now, but for something else, something it no longer fully represented. Lily watched him, her expression steady but quiet, as if she understood that whatever was happening in that moment was not something she could influence, not directly, And for the first time since they had met, she did not try to explain further, did not try to justify. She simply stood there, present, letting the truth exist without embellishment. Ethan's grip on the contract tightened slightly, not out of anger, but out of realization, and then, with a small, decisive movement, he set it back down on the table, but not in the same place, not in the same alignment, as if even that small detail no longer needed to be exact. This agreement, he said slowly, his voice measured but no longer detached, was built on the assumption that everything could be controlled. Lily remained silent, her eyes on him, her posture open, waiting, and Ethan finally looked at her again, really looked, his gaze no longer evaluating, but recognizing. But I was wrong, he added quietly, and the admission did not come easily. It settled into the room like something unfamiliar, something he was not used to offering, and yet it felt necessary in a way he could not ignore. Lily's expression softened just slightly at that, not in relief, not in victory, but in understanding, because she knew what it meant for someone like him to say those words. You cannot plan a family, she said gently, her voice calm. You can only choose one. Ethan held her gaze for a long second, the words echoing in a way that did not fit into any structure he had built before, and then, without hesitation, he reached for the contract again, this time not to review it, not to adjust it, but to end it, his fingers moving with a quiet certainty as he tore through the pages, the sound sharp but final, breaking the last piece of something that had once defined everything between them. And when he let the pieces fall onto the table, the room felt different, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with what had just been released. No more terms, he said, his voice steady, his gaze fixed on hers. No more conditions. And for the first time since she had walked into that auction room, Lily felt something shift completely, not just in him, but in the space between them, as if what had begun as an agreement had finally become something real. The pieces of paper lay scattered across the table, no longer sharp with authority, no longer defining anything, just fragments of something that had already lost its meaning, and Lily stood there quietly, her eyes resting on them for a moment before lifting back to Ethan, her expression calm but searching, as if she needed to understand not what he had done, but why he had done it. The room felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because something invisible had shifted completely, something that could not be written down or signed or enforced, and for the first time, there was no clear structure holding them in place, no defined roles, no expectations laid out in advance. What happens now? She asked softly, her voice steady but carrying a question that went far beyond the words themselves, and Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because for once, he was allowing himself to consider something without calculating it first. He stepped closer, not with the distance he had maintained before, but with a quiet certainty, his gaze meeting hers fully, without the barrier of analysis that had always been there. Now, he said slowly, his voice calm but grounded in something more real than anything he had said before, we choose. The words settled between them, simple, but carrying more weight than the entire contract ever had, and Lily held his gaze, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that might suggest this was temporary. But there was none, only a quiet sincerity that felt unfamiliar and yet undeniable. And if I choose to walk away? She asked gently, not as a threat, not as a test, but as a truth she needed to acknowledge, and Ethan nodded once, his expression unchanged. Then I will still make sure he has everything he needs, he replied without hesitation, because that was never conditional. The answer landed softly but deeply, and something in Lily's expression shifted, not surprise, not relief, but recognition, as if she understood that this was no longer about obligation, but about something else entirely. A quiet moment passed between them, and then, without rushing it, without forcing anything into place, Lily took a small step forward, closing the last bit of distance that had remained between them, her voice softer now, but steady. I do not want a contract, she said, her eyes holding his. I want something real. Ethan's gaze did not waver, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his response. So do I, he said simply, and the words carried no conditions, no hidden terms, just a quiet truth that felt stronger than anything written on paper. Days later, the hospital room felt brighter, not because anything dramatic had changed, but because something steady had taken root, something that did not need to announce itself to be real. And Lily sat beside the bed once again, her hand resting gently over the small fingers she had promised never to let go. While across the room, Ethan stood near the window, not distant, not observing from the outside, but present, his attention not divided, not calculated, simply there. "Are you staying?" the boy asked again, his voice softer now, but filled with the same quiet hope, and Lily smiled, her answer coming without hesitation. "We are," she said, glancing briefly at Ethan, and he nodded once, not as a formality, but as a choice, his gaze steady, grounded in something he had never allowed himself to believe in before. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Fast, structured, predictable. But inside that room, something else existed, something that did not follow those rules, something built not on control, but on connection. And as Ethan stepped closer, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the bed, not claiming, not directing, just present, he realized something he had never understood before, something no system or structure could have taught him, that the life he had planned was never what he truly needed, and the family he had tried to create through control had only become real the moment he let go of it. And in that quiet, steady space, with no contracts left to define them, they did not need anything else to know they had chosen something that would last.